Welcome all to the third book launch of this year. I'm very happy to see so many of you present again. Let me introduce Claudia Swan to you. Professor Swan studies and teaches Northern European visual culture, art and science, the history of collecting, the history of imagination, and the global Baroque. She is the author of the Clutius Botanical Watercolors on Renaissance botanical illustrations and of Art, Science and Witchcraft in Early Modern Holland, which studies the intersection of empiricism and witchcraft through the work of the artist Jacques Degaine. Professor Swan is co-editor of Colonial Botany and of Image, Imagination and Cognition. She has been a resident fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the Max Planck Institute in Berlin, CRASH at Cambridge University, and the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies. She now teaches at Northwestern University. The reason why we are here today is her latest book, Rarities of These Lands, Art, Trade and Diplomacy in the Dutch Golden Age. Thank you so much, Claudia, for being here. And I saw you nodding, so I said something wrong. Please correct me. This is your chance while I'll put your PowerPoint on.
I feel terrible because that's an incredibly generous introduction. It makes me feel very, very accomplished. But I am actually no longer on the faculty of Northwestern University. I'm the Mark Weil Professor of Art History and Archaeology at Washington University in St. Louis.
Now I feel terrible.
No. As this all happened over the past couple of months during the pandemic, it's coming in waves of news. So no, thank you so much, Stein.
Thank you for coming.
I am honored. I'm really happy and I'm excited to be here to present to you my book, Rarities of These Lands. And I'm so grateful to my friends and colleagues, Professor Stein Bissels and Dr. Marika Keblusek, for welcoming me and my work in this forum. It goes without saying, but I will say it in any case, that I would much prefer to see each and every one of you who is here in person, and to have the opportunity to thank you personally for your interest in my book and this event. And I would indeed greatly prefer being on Leiden time right now so that I could respectably join you in a drink afterwards. The upside, of course, is that we're all able to be together, albeit at such a distance. My aim in what follows, let me make sure I can do this, is to say a little bit about what I mean by rarities. Let's go. And by these lands. By these lands, I mean the Northern Netherlands, recognized in 1648 as the Dutch Republic, as a sovereign state. And I remind you that the declaration of its sovereign status, it had formerly been under the rule of the Spanish king, that the declaration of its sovereign status cost the 80 Years' War, waged from 1568 to 1648 with Spain and Portugal. Spain throughout, and for the period of the Iberian Union from 1580 to 1640, Portugal. As a quick reminder, and I love this map, of confessional dispositions and Christian allies across Europe, we may consult, well, allies and enemies, we may consult this wonderful map from Pagot's 1640 Christianography that's labeled in the key at the left, which I've pulled out. In Europe are four sorts of Christians: Protestants, Papists, Muscovites, and Greeks. The last two agree with the Protestants. So this idea of Europe as a shifting set of geographical designations, but also of confessional alliances. As for rarities, these generally originated in distant lands, such as are charted here. In another map that speaks volumes, but here about the motivations for sailing to the East Indies, which the Dutch did from the late 16th century on, whose natural commodities, nutmeg, cloves, and sandalwood, are depicted in the lower register, the size of islands. By rarities, I should say, I do mean exotica, where exotikos from the Greek denotes foreignness. The sorts of rarities or foreign objects that the Dutch encountered, traded in, collected, exchanged, and even pirated were precious foreign objects. Here, a sampling of some of them. My book is about how and why the Dutch made these sorts of exotic goods from pepper, and this image contains a photograph of fossilized pepper that was excavated from the wreck, the shipwreck I just mentioned in the previous slide. So this is actual pepper that was transported by a VOC ship that sank in 1613. Lacquerware at the top left, Chinese porcelain in the middle, an exotic shell from the Indo-Pacific region, Ceylonese, presumed to be Ceylonese fan carved of ivory, birds of paradise, these actual stuffed taxidermied birds of paradise. And at the far left, a kind of rarity that I talk more about in my book, or an example of a rarity of these lands, in the sense that it is a painting of the Dutch stadhouder Frederik Hendrik, so a political portrait, equestrian portrait, painted on a tortoise shell. So the combination of things from afar, made Dutch in various ways. So my book is about how and why the Dutch made such exotic goods their own in the first half of the 17th century as the Dutch Republic was formed. Now, if any of these objects, or the sum of them here, reminds you of an early modern Wunderkammer, that is about right. My book began in wonder. Many years ago, in the reference stacks of the Zaal Kostbare Werken, as it was called then, the rare books room, in the University of Amsterdam library, I happened on an article in an early volume of the journal Oud-Holland. This is a great resource for PhD students still, the late 19th, early 20th century volumes of Oud-Holland, filled with archival documents. This article that I came across by chance, Een vorstelijk geschenk, a princely gift, was by the chief archivist of Amsterdam, Nicolaas de Roover, and it is a lively account of the Dutch state gift presented to the Ottoman Sultan Ahmed I in Constantinople in 1612-1613. The array of goods the Dutch presented and commissioned to present in Haarlem and Amsterdam is astonishing. But wealth was not the wonder. After all, when the Dutch East India Company, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, or the VOC, was established in 1602, nearly 6.5 million guilders were invested in the 6 chambers, or municipal headquarters: Amsterdam, Middelburg, Enkhuizen, Delft, Hoorn, and Rotterdam. Given the ample capital in circulation at the time in the northern Netherlands, it was not surprising to read that the States General, the governing body of the United Provinces, had invested between 20,000 and 30,000 guilders in thanking the Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan, for trade privileges in ports around the Mediterranean and at Istanbul. Many of the goods that the Dutch gave to thank Sultan Ahmed I for the grant of trade privileges, many of those goods, which were so bounteous they filled an entire cargo ship, were fine Dutch products: textiles, tapestries, prints, and even cheese. The presence of Edam cheese, more than 3,000 pounds of it, alongside the costly wares, seemed peculiar to me at the time when I read this article about this gift, but plausible in the context of a grand gesture of self-representation on the part of the nascent state. You give what you're good at. Stuffed birds of paradise from the Spice Islands, porcelain from China, vessels made of exotic shells mounted in gilded silver, and Asian lacquerware were also transported to Constantinople in substantial quantities, in what I thought was a Dutch twist on bringing coals to Newcastle. Why, I wondered, did the Dutch state elect to give such precious goods from the East to the Ottoman Sultan? Who did the Dutch think they were? At least against the backdrop of dominant conceptions of Dutchness, most of them the product of 19th century nationalistic historiography, the image of the nascent republic being deeply invested in foreign wares other than porcelain struck no chord, not to mention how odd it seemed to me then to imagine Dutch statesmen at the dawn of the 17th century negotiating with the Ottoman court. And I show you here just two documents of that particular exchange. So on the left, the official signature of the Sultan in which he is signing the capitulations, the trade capitulations, granting trade rights to the Dutch. And on the right, another signature by one of the Sultan's advisors, Khalil Pasha, who was instrumental in organizing the state gift, preserved by the wonderful humanist Ernst Brink in an album in the Koninklijke Bibliotheek. And it occurred to me putting together this slide how these documents of this exchange with the Ottoman court are lying several meters away from each other in the Nationaal Archief, the National Archive in The Hague, and the Royal Library, but they don't participate, generally speaking, in what we think of as the early years of the Dutch 17th century or the formation of the Dutch state. This large picture, painted by Hendrik Cornelis Vroom in 1599, the return of the second expedition to the East Indies, heralded a new era in the Dutch world. On the day depicted, 19 July 1599, church bells rang out and shots were fired in celebration of the return of the second Dutch fleet to the east and the first that was considered a success. In the painting, the weather is glorious, with just enough of a breeze for a show of Dutch colors in the many flags and pennants. Boats fill the harbor, some carrying elegant parties and others bearing drunken onlookers. The party boat is in the lower right. An inscription on what is considered the original frame of this painting declares that the four vessels, the Mauritius, the Holland, the Overijssel, and the Friesland, vessels that were named for the stadtholder Prince Maurits of Nassau and for three of the northern provinces of the Netherlands, had, quote, sailed to Bantam to obtain spices, end quote. And then it also states, having planted trade, these vessels returned richly to Amsterdam the 19th of July, 1599. Now, global trade made Dutch merchants rich, and Amsterdam, the foremost city in the Netherlands, into the European port of entry for novel commodities. One of the pictorial legacies of this period is an iconography of Amsterdam at and as the center of the world. And this is an iconography that another dear colleague, Elmer Colfin, has written about. So Amsterdam as Omphalos Mundus, or the navel of the world. So global trade made Dutch merchants rich, and Amsterdam, the foremost city in the Netherlands, into the European port of entry. One of the most familiar sorts of imports at this time is porcelain. And the familiarity of porcelain as an import, not only because it's been written about so much, but also because it spawned an industry that mimicked it, Delftware, makes it easy to overlook how shot through with foreign rarities the Dutch Republic was at the time of its emergence. So normally we would say, oh yes, the Dutch loved foreign goods such as porcelain. In fact, they loved porcelain so much that they made their own sort of porcelain, not knowing how porcelain was actually made, which is to say Delftware. And this is a wonderful example of Dutch Delftware on the right that mimics the coloring of Chinese porcelain that was being imported at the time, and even bears a fake inscription on the inside, dating it to 1581, probably almost half a century before it was made. And the same holds true for tulips. Tulips are another example of rarities that arrived in great numbers from Central Asia. They have since become the emblematic Dutch flower. But these two, sort of like porcelain, are foreign things the Dutch made their own. I'm not sure why this is here, but I'll come to it. A decade ago, I set out to write a book about collections and collectors in early modern Holland. That's what I thought I was going to write about, and about the aesthetics of possession. But from the outset, I couldn't shake the grip of that remarkable diplomatic gift presented to the Ottoman Sultan Ahmed I. This was not the first Dutch state gift made by the nascent republic to a foreign power. The French king, the English court, and rulers in the Far East, too, received presentations in the first decades of the 17th century as the republic was coming into being. But the gift to the Ottoman Sultan was nothing short of spectacular. There is a lot to say about this gift, and I do in the book. But I mention it here because the goods presented to Sultan Ahmed I are referred to in contemporary documents as rarities of these lands. Sorry, I think, well, I want to, sorry about this. I'll go back. This slide is examples of the sorts of things that were given. It includes a receipt for 3,138 pounds of Edam cheese. And these are not the actual goods that were given. Those do not survive, but they are examples of the sorts of goods that the Dutch give. And I just will note that of porcelain, the Dutch gave almost 900 pieces. I'll come back to that. The Dutch gift to the Ottoman court, yes, does not survive except on paper. Records tell us that the rarities of these lands that the Dutch presented, here we have an example of that phrase being used to describe allocation of money by the state to purchase these things for the Sultan. Records tell us that the rarities of these lands the Dutch presented ranged from textiles and furniture and cheese to shell vessels, porcelain, stuffed birds of paradise, and even tulips. And here we have a receipt for 200 pieces of porcelain, which was all that these merchants had, apparently, and then 6 birds of paradise and 2 more, as if an afterthought, or maybe it became evident that 2 more were available, I don't know, purchased in 1612. Now, this book began in a state of wonder at this gift, a vast present from a Protestant republic in formation to the ruler of the Ottoman Empire, from a scrappy young nation to an Islamic superpower. I saw the gift as a sort of collection, a Wunderkammer, a cabinet of curiosities, a stunning accumulation of worldly wonders, set sail for political use. And the more I studied other collections, the more rarities I encountered in references in inventories, in poems, in journals, and in state documents. Dutch rarities presented to the Sultan included stuffed birds of paradise, as I've said, lacquerware vessels, porcelain. And in the Dutch world, rarity was associated with foreignness, the curious, the strange, the exotic. But then in what sense were non-Dutch goods from afar from these lands? And this is a structuring question of the book, what was the significance of the Dutch state representing itself in the early modern geopolitical sphere as source and master of foreign goods? The more I studied the acquisition and exchange of rarities in the Dutch orbit, the more challenging it became to assess the values associated with them in a political vacuum. The traffic of worldly goods by the Dutch along Eurasian trade routes in the formative years of the Dutch Republic became my driving interest, especially where that movement involved scholars, artists, poets, statesmen, pirates, merchants, scribes, sultans, and students of the natural world. The dynamics of acquisition and the efforts involved in exchange were often fraught and sometimes violent. In the early modern Dutch orbit, as in many others, aesthetics was a byproduct of access and power. And I don't want to take too much more time at all. I do want to, I have 2 slides of sort of examples of the sorts of works of art that I address, such as these. I'm very happy to have published this watercolor that purports to be an image of the emissary of the Sultan of Aceh in Amsterdam in 1602. Rembrandt's wonderful study of a Dutch man in Oriental dress seems to be a sort of emblematic rarity of these lands, in the sense that it makes the domestic foreign, or vice versa, makes the exotic indigenous. Some of the other works of art, just to be sure that it's clear that asymmetrical power relations inform the exchange of rarities, to be sure that rarities in some cases, I think, I don't talk about this explicitly in the book, but I think we need to think about how the concept of rarity and the acquisition of rarities collides with the possession of persons. And this is also to say that this is a book about things, but it's also a book about people. And one of the people I talk about is, for example, this merchant, depicted very beautifully here in a portrait. Well, it's an interesting portrait of a not very beautiful man, but a very beautiful portrait of a man in his shells, Jan Goberts van der Aar. As art historians, we may recognize that this is a portrait that has been identified through the help of Carl van Mander, who described it shortly after it was painted, and identifies the sitter, tells us it's a exceptionally pleasing image. But one of the things that I think it has remained important to me in my research is to look across these sorts of art historical documents, if you can call a painting a document, or art historical phenomena. It was important to me to recognize that Jan Goberts van der Aar was a merchant, yes. We knew that, I think, but he was one of the initial investors in the Dutch East India Company. So his interest in shells, I think, has to be seen against that backdrop. And also that in a letter that he wrote to the naturalist Carolus Clusius in 1597, that does not often get cited in conjunction with the art historical story that is told about portraits of this time, or the work of Goltzius, he speaks for what I would call an aesthetics of rarity. He wrote to Clusius, "I desire things that are rare and appealing, and I covet colorful flowers. The rarer they are, the more covetous I am." So it became interesting. So I give this as an example of some of the people. There are others, which if we have time, I'm happy to talk about. And the ways in which I found sort of intersecting lines of interest in trade, in politics, and in rarities, after all.
All right. Thank you very much, Claudia, for this very interesting and beautifully illustrated introduction to your book. Our referent of today is Marika Keblusek. She is lecturer at our own department of art history here at Leiden, but now she is for a year resident fellow at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study, researching the early modern album Amicorum, friendship album, and issues like the combination of manuscript and print, the role of personal connections, and aspects of visual and textual culture. But Dr. Keblusek has also worked on the Kunstkammer. Among other topics, she studied the cultural exchange between Thomas Howard, Earl of Arundel, and Philippe Heinhofer. That makes her the ideal referent for Claudia Swan's book. Marika, thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours, and I'm gonna put your PowerPoint on. There it is. Floor is yours, Marika.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Okay, well, thank you so much, Stijn, for inviting me indeed to reflect upon Claudia's book today. And also thank you, Claudia, for accepting me so graciously as your co-speaker today. Let me see. So a small street near the Binnenhof in The Hague, the center still today of Dutch government, and also the oldest part of the city, bears an unusual name. Let's see whether this works. Stijn, can you? Yeah, there it is. There we go. It bears an unusual name, the Cassowary-straat, or the Cassowary Street. Now, this street originally went by another name, but became known already in the early 17th century for the Casuaris, an inn or pub, perhaps even a brothel, certainly active in 1623 and possibly before. And this pub, in turn, was named, so Hague history goes, for the cassowary bird that was given to Prince Maurits by the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, in 1614. The colorful and exotic cassowary bird, you can see him here walking in from the left, a large walking bird native to New Guinea, Indonesia, and northern Australia, was a rarity of the faraway lands the VOC traded with, and was officially presented by this, well, sort of national commercial company to the symbolic head of the Dutch Republic, the Prince of Orange. And the bird was housed, or rather curated, in the prince's collection of living things, his menagerie or zoo, Maurits kept at his country estate in Rijswijk. Now, the fact that the gift of this bird to the prince was shortly afterwards memorialized in the name of a local pub, which subsequently lent its name to the street this pub was located in, allows another twist, another layer to the lands the title of Claudia's book alludes to. For the cassowary, a living emblem of the exotic world had now been transformed into the sign of a Dutch inn, and it may well have been one of these signs hanging over the entry door. Its image had become part of the fabric of everyday life in the 1620s Dutch Republic, and it had become as much a local icon as its native counterpart, the stork that symbolizes The Hague. We can see here a pillowcase of the early 17th century of the Hague stork. It had, as Claudia just phrased it in her talk, made the foreign into the domestic. And thus, indeed, the cassowary presented to the prince had become a rarity of these lands, firmly and symbolically situated in the Dutch Republic. Now, woven into this anecdote about a wondrous animal, then, we find trade, power, and the exotic combined, as well as aspects of art, collecting, and knowledge cultures of the time. In a nutshell, we encounter many of the notions Claudia discusses in her important new book, Rarities of These Lands, Art, Trade, and Diplomacy in the Dutch Republic. Claudia's premise is to show how exotic things underpinned the nascent Dutch Republic and how these objects permeated Dutch art, culture, and society in a wide variety of ways. In a series of 8 richly detailed and meticulously researched chapters, she shows how exotic things indeed were central to overseas trade, domestic commerce, collections, the visual arts, diplomatic alliances, and the evil twin of foreign trade, war at sea and on land, bounty, piracy, looting. The Dutch Republic, Claudia argues, could secure a place on the world's economic and political stage precisely because of the centrality of this trade in foreign goods. We have just heard her explain that a bit more, secured through peaceful and violent encounters with foreign powers and people. In fact, this foreign trade made Dutch society and culture come into being, creating an aesthetic taste for foreign objects as a result. Indeed, Claudia claims, Dutch identity was structured around the exotic, and these are her words. Exotic objects were imported, collected, traded, exchanged, represented, and reacted to, and thus played, she writes, a critical role in the developments in international relations, science, trade, and the arts through which the Dutch Republic made itself known. Now, Claudia's emphasis on the centrality of the exotic as a quintessential aspect of early modern Dutchness is an exciting culmination of almost 3 decades of intense research in the histories of collecting, of science and knowledge, of cultural and commercial exchange, and of the visual arts. As much inspired by the cultural turn in the humanities in the late 1970s as by a new consideration of early modern collections and the production of knowledge, historians of art, philosophy, science, and economy, among others, began to re-examine their traditional topics, resulting in exciting interdisciplinary work on, for example, the cultural, economic, and societal role of art. Rarities of These Lands may, in a sense, be read as the decisive closing argument to what a pioneering exhibition in the Amsterdam Museum and the 2 accompanying catalogues that we see here had tentatively brought to the research table in 1992. Enticingly titled De Wereld binnen Handbereik, that is the world within hand's reach, Elinor Bergveld en René Kistemaker, the exhibition's curators, set out for the first time really to dissect early modern Dutch collections of art and rarities, touching upon these topics that later become familiar in research, like the collector's identities, overseas trade, domestic trade, categories of art and artifacts, naturalia, exotica, etc. And the timing of De Wereld binnen Handbereik in 1992 was significant. From the 1980s on, scholarly interest into the cultural history of collections, it's a bit slow, I think. The cultural history of collection in Europe had been growing quickly. I'm sure you're familiar with, many of you are familiar with these titles. Studies by Thomas da Costa Kaufmann on the art collections of Rudolf II in Prague, with the conference and book The Origins of Museums in 1989, and a publication also 1989, with the start of a publication of the academic Journal of the History of Collections, still running and very much alive today. In quick succession, other landmark books followed, such as Paula Findland's Possessing Nature on Early Modern Museums in Italy, 1994, and Lorraine Daston and Catherine Park's influential Wonders and the Order of Nature from 1998. And these books in turn inspired numerous, I would say hundreds of books and articles, which have changed our view on European and non-European cultural exchange in the early modern period, a time in which the Dutch Republic played such a pivotal role. And these studies encompass more than the history of art collections, with their focus on wonder, nature, exotica, knowledge, science, trade. They share a common theme, and it has already been named, of course, by Claudia just now. This common theme is wonder, a concept encapsulated in a contemporary term for the early modern cabinet of curiosities, the Kunst- and Wunderkammer. Wonder is also the sense driving the interest in rarities in Claudia's book. All knowledge begins in wonder, she quotes Aristotle, and it was wonder about all things rare and strange that drove the study, the trading that we can see here in this painting, and the collecting of miraculous natural and exotic objects in 16th and early 17th century Europe. As Claudia asserts in her book, in the Dutch Republic, these notions of wonder and rarity fused in a particularly poignant way with mechanisms of trade and economy, thus defining what she labels as Dutch exoticism. And I think in this slide we see, although it's of course later in the 17th century, we can see an image of what this very, well, in a sense, foreign and domestic Dutch exoticism looks like. So what about Dutch art and exoticism? Despite the large quantities of exotic fineries and precious wares brought over by the VOC's trade fleet, so readily available on the Dutch market, we have just seen an image of that, and so eagerly scooped up by Dutch burghers to decorate their homes and furnished their collections, this did not visibly translate in what was long considered the epitome of Dutchness, the clean, stark interiors of its genre paintings. Of course, referring to the important work of Willemijn Fock on this treacherous historical veracity of these painted interiors, Claudia concludes that, and I quote, "the fictions of domestic genre painting do not tend to the exotic." So we know from the work by Willemijn Fock that the interiors that we like tulips and other things that we associate with Dutchness, in fact, were fictions as well. But even in these fictions of domestic life, the exotic did not figure. Instead, we should look for its scattered traces in still lives, as Julie Berger-Hochstrasser has done, for example, and find the exotic commodities like I'm trying again to get my slide here. Here we go. We should look for its scattered traces in still lives, find exotic commodities like sugar that we can see here lying in a cone, spices or porcelain, and sometimes collectibles like the Nautilus shell encased in a gold frame put out on generously laden tables. Now, I would like to conclude my brief reflection on Claudia's book with an intriguing painting in itself, perhaps, we could talk about that, a commentary on Dutch exoticism. And this is, what else could it be? Jan van der Heijden's well-known Vanitas Still Life, room corner with curiosities from 1712. At first glimpse, the clean classicist lines of chimney and walls make this stand out as a striking example of a typically Dutch interior at the turn of the century, the 18th century. And then the rich red textiles, the foreign carpets, the chairs, silk, furnishing, take our eyes and direct our eyes to two books, Dutch Bible on the right and the Blauw Atlas on the left, both again typical symbols of Dutchness. When we look further into the painting, behind the two globes, again a feat of Dutch cartographic craftsmanship, we see a mahogany cabinet in the corner, decorated with inlaid ivory and tortoise, with two porcelain cups on top, Japanese pikes leaning against the wall next to another symbol of cartography, the rolled up map, and at last the armadillo hanging from the ceiling. Well, looking at this painting, it is clear that the exotic world has literally become an intrinsic organic part of the Dutch room. Even though we will lose all things after death and all is vanity, as the depicted book of Ecclesiastes states, here the world is certainly within hand's reach. But to what end and benefit, Van der Heijden seems to ask. The chimney painting, copied from a work by Pietro Testa, depicts the moment of Dido's suicide, of Dido's death. Dido, queen of Carthage, kills herself, according to Virgil, because her lover Aeneas, spurred on by Jupiter, has left her to continue his travels to faraway lands. So should we read this painting as a reflection on the vanity of travel, of exotic exploration and cultural exchange? Should we perhaps take the book of Ecclesiastes' admonition in a later verse 13, visible if we were only just possible to turn the page, as a pictorial and spiritual guideline? And that verse reads, "And I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven. This sore travail hath God given to the sons of men to be exercised therewith." Indeed, Dutch exoticism as benefit or as burden, as exploration or as exploitation. In her imaginative, impressive, and marvelously written Rarities of These Lands, Claudia convincingly shows us these two sides, the light and the dark, of the early modern Dutch coin. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Marika, for that really very thorough reflection on the book, and certainly with ending with this beautiful analysis of the painting of Jan van der Heijden. I give the floor to Claudia for first reaction on Marika, and I would like to encourage every one of you to put your questions in the chat. We will turn to that very shortly.
Well, my response is one of wonder. I mean, that is a stunning, accumulation of, the oversight to go from the Casuariestraat in The Hague, indeed named after this wondrous bird, to thinking about the status of the stakes, I guess, of foreign trade and exploitation within the context, as Jan van der Heijden depicts it, within the context of religious, mythological, let's say, larger historical bounds. It is just a wonderful, wonderful move, and I appreciate it. So I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful also, Marika, that you cited the Wereld binnen handbereik. So these are the two covers that you showed, are the covers of the volume of the catalog of this exhibition in 1992 and in Amsterdam, and then a bundle of essays that were published in concert with the exhibition. And it is really one of the it's too far to say it's tragic, especially with Dido here on the screen, but it's too bad that those have not been translated into English. It's really the English language scholarship is the poorer for it, but there are extraordinary resources, and so I'm honored that you set my book in some kind of a chronology alongside those, which were indeed great sources of inspiration.
All right. I'll start with the first question. That's my privilege, of course. I actually very curious about the next book you're co-editing with Marissa Baas and Hanneke Groteboer. That's about the shells, and how far does that relate to this book on your own, this monograph?
So thank you for mentioning that. It's so a book that we co-wrote. So Marissa Baas, Hanneke Groteboer, and Anne Goldgar and I, with contributions of three other authors, Roshan Watson, Anna Graskamp, and Stephanie Dickey. It will appear this summer under the title Concophilia, Art, Science, and Curiosity, something like that. Art, Shells, and Curiosity. Forgive me.
Shells, Art, and Curiosity in Early Modern Europe, right. Claudia.
Thank you. I can write the chapters. No. So, and this is a study of, how many is that? 7 different essays with an introduction by Anne Goldgar. So 6 different essays with an introduction by Anne Goldgar. Anyway, my math is off. On various, it's really sort of various ways of looking at shells. And there I pursued something that I don't in the book, which is I follow up on the idea that, generally speaking, when we talk about the collection of shells in the early modern world, we think of that as collecting nature. And when those shells are, for example, set in elaborate gilded silver frameworks or mounts, we think of that, and we talk about that as the combination, this sort of playful combination of art and nature. And what I look at is the actual, in this sense, it is related to rarities, the actual vehicles by which shells were imported to the Netherlands and collected there. And by vehicles, I do mean the ships, but I also mean the avenues, I guess. How were these shells imported? And what did it take to produce the collectible examples? And it turns out that it took a lot of labor, and took a lot of labor on the part of servants and slaves, or enslaved persons, to produce objects that were indeed, we could think of them actually as, highly produced artifacts, rather than just products of nature that appeared on the shores. So the book is a wonderful series of studies of different elements of shells and their representation, what people did with shells, how they thought with shells, and I strongly recommend it.
All right, thank you very much. I have a very brief question, actually. Why were trade rights by Jonathan van Bladeren? Why were trade rights called capitulations? The latter term sounds so negative to modern ears. Maybe you can answer that. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So the technical, in this
Oh,
sense,
okay.
the Arabic term is ahitname, and it's usually translated as capitulations. And I think in general, that is the term that is used, and it. There must be an etymological reason why they're called capitulations, but they are. But I don't know it, actually, and I wonder whether the etymological reason is not as negative as it sounds. The Ottoman Sultan capitulated to nobody, so to call it a capitulation, to think of it as the Ottoman Sultan, giving in is incorrect. But I think the etymology would show that it is a more technical term.
Then there's an edition of Alette Fleischer and Nienke van der Ven, and they refer to Esther Schröder, who wrote about giving a black voice to the Prince of Orange in the 18th century. So that's, of course, later. And the title of that book is Cupido, Suderon, Twee Moren aan het Hof van Oranje. So a bit later, of course, in date, but maybe also so relevant, I think.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of Twee Moren, if I can, and not of that particular instance, and I'm grateful for the reference. I showed the portrait of Wollebrand Gelijns de Jonge. So he's the very well-dressed fellow who was gesturing with a staff out to a fleet of ships in a harbor, and with two black males next to him. And I just want to say that in the study of this is an area that I think we need to continue to do research on, is the relationship between trade, travel, and the exploitation of individual persons, Black Africans, enslaved persons, of course, among them. And just to say, I continue to be sort of disturbed by a way of looking at Dutch interest in exotic things. For example, in the case of the Asia and Amsterdam exhibition at the Rijksmuseum, where that painting very prominently, but not one word was spoken in the wall label about the two black males that are depicted there. And so I just would say, I think this is a very important issue to keep working on for further work.
All right. Then there's a chat text by Susanne van der Merendonk. Thank you very much for your presentation. I very much look forward to reading your book. I wonder, and that's about the diplomacy, I wonder if the Dutch use in international diplomacy of objects derived from the Indies, obtained through the trading authority of the VOC and the WIC, is directly tied to the aspirations to be ranked as a free republic within the European diplomatic hierarchy. So Dutch possessions, including subjugated kingdoms, formed an important argument in that process.
So that's a great and important question. And what I would say is what I think is, so yes, for me, what I looked at was the way in which access to trade was the capital on which the Dutch staked their political claims. They compared themselves explicitly to the Portuguese, whom they said were merchants who lived like princes, right? So merchants who became very rich in the 16th century. And so I'm not sure about the technicality there. I mean, for example, in the case of the Dutch gift to the Ottoman Sultan, if you pushed me to say, well, why did they give these things? Why did they give birds of paradise? Why did they bring coals to Newcastle? I would say it was to demonstrate their what they had access to by way of trade.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But in that sense, yes.
Yeah. Interesting. A question by Nienke van der Ven. Did the trade in curiosities change towards the end of the 17th century? So how does it carry on into the 18th century?
Yeah. So this is an important question. I frame the argument of my book as up to the middle of the century. So I look specifically at the way in which trade was harnessed to political aims in the context of the founding of the Dutch Republic and the establishment of the Dutch Republic. And Benjamin Schmidt, for example, in Inventing Exoticism, has written extensively about the production of an exotic aesthetic his materials are mostly in the later part of the 17th century. There is certainly one could say almost an explosion with the establishment of Dutch trade routes, which, the Dutch were truly Johnny's come lately to the Asian trade world, to the intra-Asian trade network when they set out. And as I show, and other scholars have shown this too, their early exploits were, their early successes were very often, more often than not, due to piracy than they were to anything like actual trade, fair trade, let alone fair trade. And this changes after mid-century, yes, when there is really a clearer, I think, administration and government and establishment of the Dutch in the East Indies. And somebody like Rumphius, who works for the Dutch East India Company more or less as a naturalist for many decades and is the author of a great volume on shells, which I talk about in Conchophilia. He talks about the sort of production of Kunstkammers in the fatherland, he says, and as if, and we know this from other documents too, that the VOC becomes a much more, much better organized and venue or avenue for the export of exotica back to the Netherlands. I showed very quickly a slide of things that have been excavated from the wreck of the Witte Leeuw, this ship that sank off St. Helena in 1613. And one of the things that I think is so extraordinary about the excavation of that ship's contents is that because the VOC was, of course, very bureaucratic, we have the Bill of Lading, the original Bill of Lading, and we know what was loaded on that ship when it left Batavia, I think, Bantam. And pepper was on the ship, for example. But there was no porcelain is listed on the ship's Bill of Lading, nor were any shells listed, nor was the egg of a cassowary. Mm-hmm. Those items were all found on the sea floor, which is a very clear indication, as scholars before me have pointed out, or very clear, strong suggestion that individual sailors, individual captains brought back these individual goods, mm-hmm, hoping probably to sell them. But this becomes much more, I would say there's a much greater flow of these goods in the later part of the century. It does change.
All right. This is a question for Marika. To what extent did the collection of curiosities, so including animals such as your cassowary, Marika, how did that relate to durable collectibles such as shells?
Well, I don't think that necessarily it's a question for me. I'm not
when I see cassowary, when I see cassowary, I have to think about you.
I'm forever now linked to this bird, right? No, I mean, you can think of it, and I'm looking also at Claudia to answer this. How did it relate? I mean, this was another type, another category in a sense, and I think that I mean, it was, of course, it required a different curation and display because these were living specimens, and we know that other animals were also collected and were used in the diplomatic or the cultural diplomacy of the 16th and 17th century, not just from the Dutch, but also, for instance, from the Portuguese to the Italians and vice versa. There was a constant to and fro of animals, exotic animals that were given and so on. Often they died and were not kept alive. But yes, you have to distinguish from shells, because the shells were kept in drawers or little cabinets or whatever indoors. And then you have the living collection. And of course, you also have another living collection in gardens. So that is all, but it's also part of the same system, I would say. But I'm looking at Claudia again to perhaps add something to that observation.
Yeah. So, and I mean, you've said it all. I would just say that one of the things that is striking about looking across the kinds of documents that I was able to study, so inventories and bills of lading and records of what was unloaded from ships, is how many animal parts were unloaded in the Netherlands. So birds' beaks and of course feathers. It's important to remember that, as Mark has said, many live animals were transported. Not all of them survived the travel. So, let's just take a moment to remember that the rhinoceros that Dürer depicted in his woodcut 1515 was a diplomatic gift from the Sultan of Gujarat to the King of Portugal. It arrived live in Portugal, and what did the King of Portugal do with it? What do you do with a rhinoceros? You give it to the Pope. So, he passed it on, he re-gifted it, and it died on the way to Rome, that actual rhinoceros. Likewise, and I would have talked about this if we had more time, the elephant Hansken, who is a rather famous live animal, exotic animal that made it to the Netherlands and then traveled throughout Europe, died in Florence 20 years after arriving in the Netherlands. The elephant Hansken came back on a VOC fleet, but a lot of tusks also came back on fleets. And birds of paradise, for example, those were always brought back stuffed, or let's say prepared. I wouldn't even say stuffed, but prepared and dead. But so there a lot of, and as Mark has said, the pressures for keeping live animals are different from those for keeping dead animals. Shells, of course, too, are actually the houses of dead animals, former houses of animals. So if you happen to receive an elephant, you have a problem of how to feed it and how to keep it. And there are sources and documents about this. What do you feed that white elephant? I really want to know what they fed it underway, what it was like to travel with the elephant. But of course, it's important to remember they traveled with horses, they traveled with goats, they traveled, so chickens, lots of chickens. So, but anyway, when Maurits received the cassowary, to come back to that, he did put it in his menagerie. And so we know that he had the means somehow to keep the live animal, to keep it alive for quite a while.
If I may add something to that, just when you spoke about animal parts, Claudia, another great collector, we're both sort of familiar with him, Bernardus Paludanus, actually had a little cabinet that was labeled like parts of animals. It was like, well, anything that's sort of lying around, just throw it in there, and you could find all kinds of bits and pieces, really.
Another question is about translation. How much did translation in the linguistic sphere, so the Malaya-Dutch trade book, for example, impact your thinking about the movement and manipulation of objects themselves?
Yeah. So I talk a little bit about translation in the preface of the book as an underlying sort of principle or dynamic. It's of course a problem, linguistic problem, and then translation, which means the movement of things from place to place. It is a wonderful concept or dynamic in that sense, to think about the objects and the people that I describe. So there are, and that is also to say, there are various kinds of translations. So the first Dutch Malay phrase book was published by and was published in Amsterdam, and it was published by somebody who had traveled to the East Indies, and it's published in 1603. There are records of psalms that have been translated into Malay that were in the East Indies, taken by the Dutch to the East Indies in the 1620s. Arabic, so there was a lot of, actually, I talk about this as something that tends to be overlooked, is the sort of interwoven, or I don't know, intersecting interests of the Arabic, largely Ottoman world and the European world. So you have Arabic scholars who are able to help in the Netherlands, help Maurits frame a letter to the Sultan of Aceh in 1602, or an Arabic traveler who comes to the court at The Hague and holds an elaborate discourse with Maurits on religion. And that, so translation was, on the one hand, I want to say, just as seems to me to be the case for exotic goods, there's a lot more translation of it in the literal sense of movement from place to place. And also, I think there was a lot more translation, linguistic translation, and interaction among different peoples and cultures than, as I said, the 19th century image of Dutch culture would have us believe.
Another question by Maggie Mansfield. How do you see Dutch published travelogues by VOC and WIC Travels as an investment in or publicity for the economic and intellectual interests in the rarities in Dutch trade?
So we've gotten to the speed answer portion of this seminar, so I would say yes. The answer is yes, absolutely. I mean, that's exactly right. Exactly. Right. It begins with Jan Huygel van Linschoten, who publishes his Itinerario in 1596, which is essentially publishing Portuguese state secrets about trade, navigation in the East Indies, life in the East Indies, as a sort of promise to Dutch merchants and navigators. And this will continue throughout the century. Yes, absolutely.
And then a question by Maria. I understood that the reason for starting VOC was to finance the wars against the Spanish with the money earned from trade instead of interest of exotism. Is that correct? Are the two in parallel?
Oh, let me just make clear. Yes, the VOC was an economic enterprise, first, foremost, a financial enterprise. And I don't mean to imply or suggest that the VOC was founded to satisfy a taste for the exotic. In fact, one of the arguments of the book is that the Dutch taste for exotic things such as porcelain so porcelain is not imported to satisfy a pre-existing Dutch taste for porcelain. The taste emerges out of what is traded and out of what is brought back.
Sure, yes. There's a reference to Jan Breugel, the elder, and Pieter Breugel Rubens, Flora and Zephyr of 1617, where we see two cassowaries. Thank you, Larry, for saying how we have to pronounce it, and two guinea pigs. Then there's Alexa McCarthy. There will be an exhibition about Hansken at the Rembrandthuis this year. Okay. Linnea, in looking at those objects through a political lens, can we see man-made additions to objects of nature as a form of conquest?
Well, this is interesting. I mean, I wouldn't immediately make that equation, but there's certainly very interesting, there's an interesting dynamic here that looks like conquest. But I want to point out that Delftware is very well known as an emulation, a form of emulation of porcelain, but that also there was a lacquerware industry in Amsterdam in the early 17th century, and a lacquerware maker who receives a patent in 1609 to produce what is explicitly called East Indian lacquerware in Amsterdam. And some of his work, or work that he sold, so we presume it was his work, was sent to the Sultan alongside lacquerware that was called Asian lacquerware. So lacquerware from Amsterdam and lacquerware from Asia. So you have this very quick response, I would say, artistic response, which I think is
interesting.
Whether it's always exactly conquest.
No, right. And a very last question. Oh no, there's still, sorry. Were any of these rarities from the Dutch era in North America, and where the indigenous people of North America regarded as exotic before the Brazil chapter, and apart from beaver pelts and products. A question by Amy Galani.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I would say, so exotic in the term that I use it, which, and I sort of support this by referring to things like Carolus Clusius's publication in 1605 of a book called the Exoticorum Historia Rerum. So the history of exotic things. Exotic comes from the Greek exotikos, foreign, not from here. And so in that sense, anything not from here was foreign. And so I want to be clear about that, because exotic can sound like the term Oriental. And Orientalism has a very different history and usage. And so it's not a question for me of whether specific items from specific places were necessarily more exotic than others. Anything from far away was exotic. Some things were collected more than others. And beaver pelts were used, for example. So Clusius is very interested in things from North America or from the Americas. There is a consistent interest in things, but this is something that I am working on now. So the interest in shiny objects seems to prevail. So, sheen, the sheen of shells, or the shine of ebony, or the translucent shimmer of porcelain, for example. These are the things that seem to sustain interest, aesthetic interest.
Interesting. So there's a last, Larry Silver adds that the Ars Natura fusion is stronger in German Wunderkammer, where great goldsmith frames from Seychelles nuts and Nautilus shells are enriched with ornaments and mythic gods such as Neptune. That is less the case in the Netherlands. And then I just say that Jennifer Nelson and Elsje van Kessel and many others explicitly thank you in this chat. Aww. And I want to thank both of you, Claudia and Marika, for making such a wonderful book launch. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And I'm only going to say that we have a next book launch, May 19th, with Hanneke Groteboer's book, The Pensive Image, Art as a Form of Thinking. Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you very much, Claudia and Marika. Bye-bye.